afternoon, everybody. How are you doing? You must be die-hard conference participants because it's 4:30. You should be out shopping or having a glass of wine. So thank you very much for staying with us. Before I give my presentation, I just want to bring attention to our new logo. How many of you from the Philippines? Or how many of you heard of AIM before? Great. So yesterday we launched our new logo. Mr. Yulo, this is the first time you see this, right? With our alumni. And we had a fantastic event yesterday, and that's our new logo. So you will be the first one, I'm sure, publicly they've used this logo in presentations because it just happened yesterday. Anyway, what I'm going to talk about is, do you have a microphone that I can use? Thank you very much. Can you hear me okay? Great. I'm going to just talk about a little bit in terms of what is a culture, what is a cultural competency. You can see the difference. I'm an academic. I don't do any lecture now, but I don't get to talk to a large group of people about something that also academically valuable. So I'm going to give a little bit of background. And I'm going to talk about what are the different kinds of traits in cultural competency. And then I give you some examples of different businesses where cultural competencies do matter and how they actually use the cultural competency in their businesses and their success in businesses. And also because I'm coming from the educational sector, I'll talk just a little bit about what's happening in the business education. So before I go into any of these things, I first want to say, as I was introduced, I'm a professor of marketing. So this is not really my specialty, although I do study the culture, the effect of culture and consumption behaviors and how the marketing should take into consideration. But I think what's more interesting is actually my personal journey through the last 55 plus years and how I got to have a little bit of insight on this topic. So first, I don't know if anybody could have guessed from my name, but I am Korean born. So I was born in Korea. Can you read that? Maybe you can turn down the lights a little bit if we can dim the light. Okay, so then I went to America, did my master's PhD, and then I taught at the University of Wisconsin-Madison for 9 years. So altogether I was there for about 17 and a half years. And then I went to England. If I was very brave, I would have gone to France, Italy, or Germany, and so on and so forth. But I figured at that point I barely mastered English, not even masters. I came to a point where I am not afraid of speaking English or going to parties because I have no idea what the heck people are talking about. And then I was feeling afraid of somebody asking me questions just in case I don't understand. So I didn't want to tackle another language. So I chose England as my next destination. My mistake was they don't actually speak the same English. It's completely different English. So I had to learn English all over again. So you see my English is kind of mixture because English is not my mother tongue. I'm Korean. I lived in Korea until I was 22. So I learned English in America, but then I spent 15 years in England, so I have some odd pronunciations. But over those 15 years, I actually spent 2 years in Spain. So 2007 till 2009, I actually lived in Madrid, working at Instituto Empresa as a research professor. And then I came here in 2015 as the Dean of Asian Institute of Management, and I became concurrent president and dean in October of that year. So combine that with the fact that I traveled to about 60 different countries, unfortunately most of them on a business trip rather than holidays. I'm looking forward to my retirement days because I do have my favorite places to go back on my holiday, not on a work trip. What I can tell you is that I had a chance to observe different cultures, the effect of cultures, how people work, how people live, and how those understanding of the cultures play an important role in a business setting. So that's mostly where I've come from rather than taking on a very theoretical role. So that makes me have a certain level of understanding about the culture, as I said. So what I can tell you is that it affects all aspects of our life. in terms of how we feel about communicating with other people, how we express emotions, and sometimes even how we think and how we write, and all of those things. And also the fact that you are exposed to multicultural environment will make a huge difference in terms of how we see other people. I strongly believe the fact that you watch movies and you read about other cultures in books, they don't actually give you the same kind of experience. Obviously, those kind of vicarious experience do play a role, but not as much as having the opportunity to completely immerse in different cultures. So I think that's where the value of education where you will be exposed to different cultures come to play a role. And I know those understanding of the cultural diversity and the cultural competencies often make a difference in terms of how organizations and enterprises can succeed in achieving their goals. So I've been talking about culture and cultural competency, but I just want to spend a brief time to define what we mean by culture. There are many millions of definitions of culture. One of my PhD students who was looking at the effect of culture, and in fact it's called acculturation, the effect of acculturation on how we give gifts to other people as well as how we give gifts to ourselves. At the very beginning of a PhD study, she compiled about 500 different definitions of culture, depending on whether you're talking about economic definition, psychological, sociological, anthropological. So there are many, many different types of definitions, but it basically talks about shared beliefs, shared values, and shared norms. So this is something shared amongst a large group of people. And within that, we often talk about subculture. So within a big culture, we can also talk about different subcultures within this larger culture. And it's all about cultural competency. It's all about personal as well, which means individual, as well as a collective ability to understand what's going on in that culture. So if you try to understand the effect of cultural competency within the organization, you have to look at what are the cultural competencies of your individual employees, but also there's such a thing as a cultural competency of the organization or the unit. So there are two different things that are going on there, and they relate to attitudes, knowledge, skills, and all the things that you can think about. So the proof of cultural competency is when those individuals as well as organizations collectively can work together to drive success as well as a common goods. So when we talk about the cultural competencies, we can talk about three different kinds of contexts. The first is international business. Most important here is your openness to understand and to actually get down to issues such as different countries and different perspectives, tastes and trends, and there are different ways of conducting businesses. I think that openness is very, very important. And in fact, when I came back to Asia, I should say, if you look about my journey, I went around the entire globe almost. Studied Korea, went to America, went to England, went to Spain, and then I came to the Philippines. So when I came back to Asia after 32 years, I realized actually that we are so ahead of so many things in this part of the world, but then there are certain things that I feel quite behind. And one of those things is this acceptance of other cultures. The kind of, if I may kind of sidetrack a little bit, the kind of comments and attitude that I know they can go to jail for, we can talk about it very, very openly in this country. And then I find that a bit, I was quite taken aback at the beginning, if I may say so. So I think that openness to accept other cultures, other ways of doing things is very, very important. And obviously there are skill levels that we can talk about. So cultural diversity is all about having respect for the other cultures, other ways of doing business, other ways of communicating, other ways of doing and having your life. But also, it's not just stopping at the understanding or the respect, but you also need to represent those values and those perspectives within your organization. So just believing in those differences and having respect is one thing, but you also need to reflect that in your day-to-day operations in your business. So having female staff, being able to open your organizations to people of different kinds of beliefs, different kind of values, different kind of religions, different kind of sexual orientations. I think that's all very, very important. And attunement. And attunement is all about being open to different kinds of differences and emotionally being able to relate to those kind of differences. Intercultural communication is from there, how do we actually communicate? How do we actually understand? How do we actually willing to accept those differences? So now I'm going to go through the cultural dimensions very quickly to get to the points of cultural competence. And I know many of you are very familiar with the Hofstede multicultural dimensions. And initially he studied individualism, collectivism, how cultures want to avoid uncertainty. In other words, how cultures can actually deal with ambiguity. There's another way of saying it. Masculinity versus feminism. In a masculine culture, assertiveness, accomplishment, the fact that you can actually award purely based on what you're able to accomplish. Those things are very important. Whereas if you are in a feminine culture, we're talking about how you care for other people, how you value harmony, how you value cooperative working relationships. Power distance is very interesting. It's how you accept the fact there is a gap between people with the power and people without the power, and how that manifests within the organization. Now, he actually, I don't know if you can read this, later on the cultural dimensions, later on that we added more dimensions, 2 more dimensions, that way you have an asterisk, short-term versus long-term, indulgence versus restraint. So sometimes you hear people talk about happiness index, that's where that's come from. So overall, cultural competencies and how businesses are accepting the understanding of these dimensions and how their practice is very important. So I'm going to go through some of this quickly because I know the cue card is flashing there. So the organizations that are promoting collectivism tend to be more successful. People who are open to uncertainty, organizations and countries who are willing to accept uncertainty also tend to do better. Balanced masculinity and femininity, I don't think I have to explain that a lot. Last thing is a low on power distance. In other words, there is the feeling of equality, whether you are a janitor, whether you're a secretary, whether you're a director, or the president, the CEO, chairman, that people do not have to worry about that distance. I think those are very important characteristics. Now, I'm going to just quickly go through, but what you see in the green boxes are the extreme cases, the lowest, for example, in each of these characteristics. Just to remind you, this is individualism, collectivism, uncertainty avoidance, gender, masculinity, femininity, and then power distance. Now, if you think about where I started, I left Korea partially, not only to learn, but also because I didn't like the fact that everybody had to behave exactly the same way, copy each other. If you are different, that people always criticize you for being different, and I was always so different. The power distance is about 60, that's quite high. So there are a lot of things about Korea I liked, but also I didn't like. So I went to America. Can you see how extreme it is in terms of individualism versus collectivism? One of the things I had to learn is I couldn't translate we all the time because Americans always talk about I. Everything is I. I hope there is no American in this room. I'm not offending anybody. But so that's where I spent 17 and 18 years. And then I went to England, similar, but now this is interesting. If you look at these 4 dimensions, numbers look quite similar, but I can tell you it's not similar at all. So the subtleties, just because they speak the same language, they're all developed countries, they look kind of same. I mean, they look same to me, but actually they're quite different. Doesn't actually get you the full understanding. And then when I went to Spain, that was also different. Now, the shock here is the Philippines. This is where I struggle most at AIM. How people call everybody by sir, ma'am, president, and at Asian Institute of Management, we have one rule. Everybody has to call me by Jikyeong. That's my name, and I'll be called by that. Anybody who doesn't use my name, there's a 100 peso fine. I take them out. But my view is in the Philippines, when your politics is so strong, it makes it really, really difficult for people to challenge their boss's ideas or engage in a critical communication discussion. So I think it's very important for you to understand these basics. And then companies, if you look at those dimensions, these are some of the companies that are doing well, that is producing good result. Companies operating low power distance, low uncertainty avoidance. If you look at this, go back to here, look at Singapore. Their power distance, what do you call it? Power distance as well as the individualism, very, very different. They don't really care about those kind of things, but here is the most interesting one. Their uncertainty avoidance is very, very low. In other words, they can deal with the ambiguity better, which means they are willing to innovate and experiment better. Merit-based career is very important in masculine cultures. Emphasizing individual contribution is important in individualist cultures. So you need to understand which culture you're operating and also which culture, what kind of culture you have within your organization. And does that allow you to function well for the objectives and the goals and the mission of your organization? And if it is not, then you want to think about how do I actually need to change the culture so that, for example, meritocracy plays an important role within your culture rather than people just going up the ladder. So if you look at the recognition in terms of our cultural competency is driving the success, this end is very low, this end is very high. You can look at 4, 5 at the ultimate level, different kind of organizations in terms of how cultural competence plays a role. Here are the kind of organizations I say they have no clue what we're talking about. And we can go all the way to the end, which is most ideal. This is where integration of cultural diversity, in other words, they have understanding, they are aware where the shortcomings are, and they are aware of what are the kind of changes they need to make in order for them to arrive at their mission in a most harmonious way. So some common traits, cultural diverse competency at the board level and governance policy. So it's not just something that you can do at individual level. This is why we talk about the collective level as well. You need to have a right kind of systems and the processes. Openness, respect, and those things I've already talked about. You need to think about overall position in terms of your country, your culture, of your organization. You also need to think about how you communicate those differences. I'm not going to go through all the details, but perhaps I can talk about a few examples. So Google, as you know, always experimenting. They do not accept the fact that they are successful. I think those are becoming more and more important compared to, say, 20, 30, 40 years ago. The fact that you're successful today, there's no guarantee you will stay successful. You always have to, the key word here is to disrupt yourself. You have to accept the fact that if you don't disrupt yourself, what's going to happen is somebody else will come and disrupt. So you need to be able to experiment with, you need to be able to take certain level of risk rather than always going for the same. So I'll skip some of these examples. Emirates, I fly Emirates all the time when I go back home. I still have a house in England. And one of the things they really emphasize right at the beginning of the flight, and some of you who flew in Emirates will know, they will say how many different countries are represented in their crew on board, and then how many languages can be spoken by this crew. And this is one indication, but although they are UAE, Dubai based, they really emphasize the level of a cultural competency and how they play a role in terms of how they carry out their business. Disney is a very famous example. When they opened the Disney in Paris, they opened Disney in Japan, they opened Disney in Shanghai. Although the American model is a very, very, very clear and very, very US American concept, the whole idea behind Disney, but they do make this cultural competency adjustment in terms of being able to adjust to different cultures. And it's not just a business. This is a not-for-profit organization. It's the same thing happening there. And that's part of the reason why ActionAid is very successful. So I'm going to just quickly go through education and then shut up. International business schools, they have gone through a lot of things. When I lived in America, I left America in 2000. And even by then, there are many, many American business schools, even top business schools, unless they were Harvard, Wharton, Stanford, very top. We're talking about top 5, top 6. You go there, you see nothing but white American students. And sometimes the statistics will show Chinese or a Mexican, but at the end of the day, they're actually American who originally come from there, so ethnic Chinese. So that used to be 15, 20 years ago, but now if you look at American business school, even American business school, they're very, very diverse. They're reflecting the fact that the value of the education, as I said earlier, comes from the immersive experience. And just having the American student in the classroom, although they teach fantastic materials, is not going to prepare their students very well. And they do a lot of international exchange, network, partnership, and that's really helping everybody. And then you will actually see the difference in terms of what's happening in industry. That's why, to me, what Trump is doing right now, if I may say so, has really detrimental effect in terms of how whole country can function, because there are so many people from other countries who studied, who came to America to study and decide to stay, and they played a pivotal role in American economy. Okay, so some concluding thoughts. Diversity and inclusion platform is very important, but your openness, your respect, your responsiveness, representation is equally important. And they will actually lead to increase the productivity, openness, innovation, and eventually success of the organization and revenue generation. And now you have to think about the different paradigm. We're not talking about competition anymore. Some of you probably heard the phrase co-petition. In other words, you're working with the competition cooperatively. And for you to be able to do that, you got to open up. You got to be able to understand the differences in perspectives, differences in cultures before you can actually engage in what we call creative collaboration. Former IBM executive Michael Cannon-Brookes once said, you get a very different thinking if you are sitting in Shanghai, Sao Paulo, Dubai, and I cannot emphasize how real that is. Depending on who is sitting in the room, what kind of cultural context you're operating, it makes a huge difference. So in the world we live in, executives get the essence of this and act accordingly. They will be the one to succeed. In America, about 40% of businesses will say, if they had a cultural competency, if they had people who can understand other cultures, other ways of doing business, that would have led to being able to expand their business. But because they lack that, they lose a lot of opportunities. About 25% of English or Wales companies will say that that these English and Welsh companies believe they lose out on opportunities because they lack the language and cultural competencies. So that's all I have prepared. Thank you very much.